We'd like to bring in a guest that we have on set with us, Hubert Davis. He served as the Assistant Director of the Office of Management and Budget in the Carter administration. Mr. Davis, thank you for joining us on this day.
Glad to be here.
Would love to get your reflection from what we have not only seen here today, but in the days preceding this, just the outpouring of support and reverence for your former boss, the 39th President of the United States.
Well, it's been amazing to me how well prepared they were for such an important event. And I'm delighted that so many people in Atlanta and in Georgia had a chance to pay their respects to him before the ultimate burial. He was a great person. I think that's been stated over and over again. And working with him, I can only say that he was a great guy to work for. And he always respected your effort. And even if you got it wrong, he really appreciated what you did. So I was honored to have been associated with him, and I really consider it one of the highlights of my life.
I'm just interested in your thoughts watching the coverage this afternoon and your reflections, Mr. Davis, on your memories as OMB director, being a cabinet member, sitting across the desk from President Carter in the Oval Office, meetings that you've been having about the economy and the machinations of government, and here we're watching this momentous occasion. What is going through your head in terms of memories of Jimmy Carter?
Well, he was a detail man, and that troubled some people. As a Georgia Tech person myself, I like details, and I like the fact that people make that kind of effort to understand what's really going on, not just superficially. So he was very good to work for and good to work with. Oftentimes he would add comments to people's recommendations, suggesting even more of this or more of that. So he was not passive in any way. He was an active president when he was president, and he knew what was going on inside and outside the government. And I think part of what people appreciate is he was straightforward and honest. And if he ever did anything that he felt like needed to be corrected, he corrected it.
Was he a misunderstood man? In other words, he did not win re-election. That came as a devastating blow, not only to President Carter, but to Rosalynn as well. President Reagan won the election and swept the Carters out of office and out of Washington. But was he misunderstood, not only from the American people's standpoint, but does history have anything about the former president wrong?
Well, I think those that say he had a presidency that did not succeed as much as people might have expected, they're wrong. He did so much. We got more legislation passed and approved by the Congress than people recognize. Something like 75% of what we put forward was ultimately approved. He was a well-established environmentalist before he got there, and he continued pushing forward ideas and plans to make America even cleaner than it was then. And to this day, many of the things he set out to do have become accepted. Solar energy being one of them. He was early to the solar energy market. Now you're right all over the state of Georgia. You see solar energy farms everywhere, generating clean energy for the population. So he was a person well ahead of his time in many instances.
Do you have a lasting memory? Of course, we saw the former president in his latter years very frail, very fragile. Is there a lasting memory that you particularly hold on to, whether on a personal note or through your service of his administration when he was in office?
Well, he was a very active person. He played a lot of tennis. He jogged way much more than people realize, particularly in the weekends at Camp David. He loved to play baseball and softball. He loved to go to the Braves games. he was a sports fan. He did a lot of sports.
You told us while we were watching the coverage of the arrival of President Carter back to Joint Base Andrews that the last time you spoke to him was not at Rosalynn's funeral. He was rather incapacitated there, but on their anniversary day. What was that conversation like not too long ago?
It was just, hello, how are you? hope you're feeling better than you did the last time. He was very, very. I always had that grin, and which I always appreciated. So he was an easy guy to work with and be around at all times, whether it was towards the end or whether it was in the middle.
Yeah, you plan on attending the funeral in Plains. Is that correct?
I don't know yet. Depends on the weather. We've got some bad weather coming in, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, yeah. What do you think people should remember most about your former boss?
What an honest person he was. What a hard-working person he was. How much he cared about the United States of America and the world at large. How much he cared about the least successful people, whether they be in the United States or in other parts of the world. So I just thought he was as good as you get. My neighbor used to say that if you want to be close to Jesus, just stand next to Jimmy Carter. That was my neighbors who didn't vote for him, by the way.
I'm interested. You held this important office of management and budget director. Jimmy Carter has been described so many times as such a deeply faithful man, a gentle man, a faithful man. Washington is not necessarily a friendly place to be and operate. In fact, if you're like what Jimmy Carter is described as, you can be a real fish out of water up there. How did he reconcile being all the things we know about Jimmy Carter to be versus the bloodbath that Washington, D.C. can often be?
He was the same all the time. He was not a political Christian, if you will. He was an active Christian his entire life, and he lived those values and standards when he was in the White House, and he didn't care who knew it. If people felt like he was a little too religious, so be it. He was the way he was. Went to church every Sunday at a Baptist church in downtown D.C. and had religious leaders of all sorts visiting him while he was in the White House, and meet with others. He was a person that what you saw is what you got.
We talk about how disappointing it was for him and how much of a blow it was to not be reelected. Do you ultimately believe that this was his fate, his humanitarian efforts, the decades later that surpassed his presidency, and the huge impact he and Rosalind and Carter and the Carter Center has had globally?
Well, I thought he did a great job as president, so I'm biased. But his post-presidency was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. I was involved with it from the time the Carter Center was proposed, and continued to stay involved and supported it every way I can. I think it's amazing that you've got a former president of the United States who hosts Sunday school classes in his hometown church every Sunday. For anyone who can walk up and walk in the door is welcome to attend. I just think that's amazing that he goes out for a week every year to build Habitat for Humanity houses and encourages others to do so. And the number of houses built as a result of Carter and the other people who he brought aboard is astonishing and very helpful in this day and time when housing is so expensive.
Yeah. I mean, it just underscores what you said. He was a Christian, but he lived it and he walked it and he talked it.
As we watch these live pictures together of the former president making his way into the nation's capital, did the Carters, from your vantage point, enjoy life in the White House and in Washington, D.C.?
To the extent I know, they certainly did. I mean, what's not to like? It was a great place, and they took full advantage of it. They were very social in the proper sort of way. They had private visitors come. They had state dinners. They had congressional dinners. They had congressional Christmas parties. They had 4th of July fireworks. It was a busy place.
Yeah, I remember watching a documentary about how his association just with the music of that time and all these different artists that he would bring into the White House. Talk about how that was important for him to socialize with people who may not look like you or have the same background as you.
Well, the rock and roll president, as he's often called by some folks, fitted him well because he was a musician or an appreciation of music, of all types of music. It seemed to me like one of the things that helped in the campaign in '76 was the musicians, because he had this sort of image of being a super Christian, etc. And they sort of help settle, not disabuse anyone of that thought, but help see he's a well-rounded person. He's not just one way. I think that the music and the people in the music community helped him a lot, and I'm grateful that they did.
The Carters and their life in Washington, D.C. President Carter, at least as far as history is concerned, and his relationship with former presidents, I wouldn't say that was a natural or a comfortable fit for him, perhaps because he was a political outsider. Would you say that is sort of how his administration operated in D.C.? He was a political outsider. He wasn't a creature of the Washington establishment. That manifested itself also in his post-presidency, according to historians, with his relationship with even Democratic presidents like Bill Clinton and the others, when they would not frequently but have the chance to reunite.
He was a politician, because you can't be president without being a politician, but politics, being a politician, was not as important as getting it right. And he made a great effort to not let politics get in the way of accomplishing things, but at the same time he didn't like for politics to drive decisions. So if you went to him and you said, this is good for you politically, he would say, well, let's find another alternative. He was just not a traditional politician, which a lot of people like, me included. I felt like that we needed a fresh air in Washington, and I think he provided that, and it was very helpful in moving the country forward during the 4 years he was there.